23rd of July, 1944, 06 hours, 10 minutes. Lieutenant Thomas Mitchell, 22nd Bombardment Squadron, opens his eyes to darkness. Not the darkness of unconsciousness. Something worse. Physical darkness. A cave. Stone walls weeping moisture. The smell of salt and rotting kelp and something else. Acrid, chemical. His own burned flesh. Pain arrives like a tsunami. Third-degree burns covering 60% of his torso, both arms, the left side of his face. The kind of pain that makes breathing a conscious decision. Each inhale feels like swallowing glass shards coated in gasoline and set ablaze. He tries to scream. His throat produces only a whisper. Jan, who's spent 40 years hauling nets from an unforgiving ocean. The man is applying more of the green substance to Mitchell's burns. Seaweed, kelp, something from the ocean floor. GS. His commander's voice echoes. If you're captured, pray for a quick death. These animals don't understand mercy. And yet, these hands are gentle. The man offers water from a metal canteen. Clean water. Mitchell's lips are cracked, bleeding. He drinks. The man steadies his head. Armed decades ago from missionaries who never returned after Pearl Harbor. Because you are son of mother. Like my son was. Malleability of human nature under the crushing weight of war. A decision that would leave permanent marks, not metaphorical ones, but literal scars mapping the topology of compassion across international boundaries etched into human skin. Null, that jammed every fourth round, shipped to an island that would become his grave, though his body was never recovered, never identified. Just another name on a list that arrived in Minato Ura village on a gray February morning carried by an officer who wouldn't make eye contact. Heat of paper with hands that trembled. He died with honor for the emperor, Nakamura said. The words clearly rehearsed, clearly hollow. Kenji read the notice 3 times. Each time the characters remained unchanged. Killed in action. Date uncertain. Location uncertain. Body not recovered. The bureaucratic language of mass death. H5. She simply folded the notice, placed it on their small household shrine next to a photo of their son, 17 years old in the picture, smiling, holding a fish nearly as long as his arm, and began preparing rice for dinner. That night, neither of them ate. They sat in silence, listening to waves crash against rocks, the same sound that had been the soundtrack to 7 generations of Tanaka fishermen. 7 generations. And now the line ended with Kenji. 3 weeks later, plastered on every building in the village, including the shrine, bold characters proclaiming American barbarism, images of American soldiers bayoneting Japanese civilians, descriptions of atrocities, mass rape, torture of prisoners, desecration of bodies. The Americans were demons, subhuman, unworthy of mercy or compassion. To show kindness to an American was to betray every Japanese soldier who died defending the homeland. Betray your son. Betray your emperor. Betray your ancestors. Dawn darkness. The ritual he'd performed 10,000 times. The ocean was unusually calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that precedes typhoons or earthquakes or other warnings from the gods. He noticed smoke on the horizon. Black smoke. The distinctive oily burn of aviation fuel. A trail descending toward the water like a finger of accusation pointing at the sea. Not there. Instead, and he'd spend 8 days trying to understand this decision, he pointed his boat toward the smoke. The closer he got, the clearer the debris field became. Aluminum fragments. Canvas shredded into strips. A tail section bearing the white star of the United States Army Air Forces. The paint still fresh. The metal still warm. And floating among the wreckage, face down, a body in a flight suit. Amon sent to the bottom where demons belong. His hands gripped the tiller. His boat was already turning. And then the body moved. Just a twitch. The reflexive movement of fingers. Not dead. Drowning. Kenji had seen enough drowning men to recognize the signs. The weak movements. The body's last desperate attempts to find air before the ocean fills lungs and drags consciousness into darkness. I would define everything that followed. In that pause, he saw his son. Not the smiling 17-year-old from the photo. The other version. The version he'd imagined 10,000 times. Hiroshi floating face down in water off Guadalcanal. Hiroshi with bullet wounds, or shrapnel tears, or malaria reducing him to a fever dream skeleton. Hiroshi calling for help that never came. Hiroshi dying alone, thousands of kilometers from home, in water that didn't care about emperors or duty or propaganda posters. Or, much worse, the kind of burns that said, this man has hours, maybe a day if he's lucky and stubborn. Only by boat during low tide, hidden by rock formations that made it invisible from both sea and land. Kenji had used it for years to store equipment, to wait out storms, to occasionally hide from tax collectors who got too curious about catch declarations. Through accumulated knowledge passed father to son for 200 years, he went to work. Accession dispute. The kelp contained compounds, alginates, fucoidins, polysaccharides with anti-inflammatory properties that Western medicine wouldn't isolate and name for another 20 years. But the Tanaka family didn't need names. They needed results. And the results worked. And, layer after layer, replacing it every 4 hours. The kelp would dry, pull heat from the tissue, reduce inflammation, create a barrier against infection. It wouldn't save the skin. Too much damage, too much tissue death. But it might save the life. Might. Nung more of the green substance. And then fever would drag him back under. During these conscious moments, his training screamed at him. You're being kept alive for interrogation. This is a trick. He's softening you up. The torture comes next. Stay strong. Name, rank, serial number. Nothing else. Die before you break. Utility. On the second day, Kenji brought rice porridge. Mitchell's throat was too damaged to chew solid food, but he could manage the porridge. It tasted of nothing. His taste buds were scorched. But it was sustenance. He ate. Kenji watched with the critical eye of someone monitoring a patient's recovery. When Mitchell finished, Kenji nodded once and left the cave to check his boat. Thing approaching human. Maybe it was the third day when Mitchell's fever finally broke and he woke to find Kenji asleep sitting against the cave wall, head tilted back, mouth open, snoring softly. Vulnerable. If Mitchell had wanted to kill him, and he had a rock within reach, could have crushed the fisherman's skull while he slept. This was the moment. Mitchell looked at the rock, looked at Kenji, left the rock where it lay. Han just water and eat. He spoke no English beyond what the missionaries had taught him in childhood. Mitchell spoke no Japanese beyond konnichiwa and arigato, learned from a phrase book during the flight to his first posting. But they found a language, gestures, drawings in the sand. Kenji would point to the kelp, then to Mitchell's burns, then make a soothing motion with his hands. Medicine, healing. Mitchell would nod. Understanding reached not through words, but through the universal G. Rammer of care. L had a photograph too, carried in a waterproof pouch in his flight suit, somehow surviving the crash and fire that should have destroyed everything. He retrieved it with his less burned hand. The right hand was barely functional, but the left could still grip. The photograph showed a woman, 22 years old, dark hair, bright smile, standing in front of a house with white siding in a town called Springfield, where the biggest excitement was Friday night football and the 4th of July parade. Catherine, his wife of 11 months. In the photograph, her hand rested on her stomach. 5 months pregnant, their first child. If boy, Thomas Jr. If girl, Elizabeth, after Catherine's mother, who died when Catherine was 12. Irene's pregnant belly. Made a connection in the air with his hands, a line from Hiroshi to Mitchell to the unborn child. 3 young people. 3 lives caught in machinery too large for any individual to stop. Hey, we're humans caught in the same insane machinery of war, suffering the same losses, grieving the same way. And Kenji understood something equally profound. Saving this American pilot wouldn't bring Hiroshi back, wouldn't change the propaganda posters or the Emperor's War or the thousands dying daily across the Pacific. But it was something. One life, one choice, one moment where the machinery could be resisted, even if just for 8 days in a cave that smelled of fish and kelp and the ocean. It's eternal indifference. Illage shrines to redirect sunlight into dark corners of holds. This mirror could save Mitchell's life. It could also end Kenji's, reducing infection. But Mitchell needed real medical care. Antibiotics, surgery, blood transfusions. Things a cave couldn't provide. Recognized by every military on Earth. He repeated it. 4 times. 5. 6. The Catalina's path shifted. It banked slightly to the left, began a slow circle. They'd seen the signal. Committing treason against his own nation. For what? For a photograph of a pregnant woman? For the memory of a dead son? For some abstract principle of shared humanity that propaganda posters said didn't exist? Possible to miss. A signal. We see you. Help is coming. Hold position. The Catalina climbed, banked east, disappeared over the horizon. Mitchell knew what would happen next. The plane would radio the nearest base. A rescue boat would be dispatched. Maybe a submarine if they were in contested waters. Probably within 12 hours. Definitely within 24. Gauge barriers and every communication obstacle imaginable managed to convey a question. He pointed to Kenji, pointed to the ocean where the Catalina had disappeared, made a boarding motion. The question was clear. Come with me. Asylum. America. Safety. You saved an American pilot. They'll give you anything. Leave this village. This war. This emperor who sent your son to die on a malarial island. Come. Head. Pointed to the village, invisible beyond the rocks. Pointed to his boat. Pointed to the photograph of Hiroshi. Made a gesture that encompassed everything. The cave, the ocean, the island, the life he'd lived for 52 years. This is home. This is my life. I cannot leave. But you, he pointed to Mitchell, then to the horizon where the Catalina had vanished. You live. You go home. You hold your baby. That is enough. An act of treason that would result in execution if discovered. Wanted to forcibly drag this stubborn fisherman onto whatever rescue boat arrived, but he couldn't. Even if language hadn't been a barrier, he couldn't, because he understood what Kenji was saying. Some choices are worth making even if they cost everything. Some moments of humanity matter more than survival. Some acts of compassion are their own justification, requiring no external validation or reward. Hours later, American sailors, heavily armed, scanning the coastline for threats. They found Mitchell in the cave, barely mobile, wrapped in tarps that reeked of fish. They found evidence of treatment, kelp paste, water containers, the remains of rice porridge. They found Kenji's mirror, left behind on the rocks. They didn't find Kenji. He'd left 4 hours earlier, before dawn, returning to Minato Ura village as if nothing had happened, as if he'd spent 8 days checking distant fishing grounds, as he'd told his wife before departing. As if he hadn't just committed treason and saved an enemy pilot and fundamentally undermined everything his government claimed about American demons and Japanese duty. The sailors assumed he was delirious. Fever dreams. They'd seen it before with burn victims. The mind creating narratives to explain survival. They carried him to the boat, evacuated him to a hospital ship. Within 36 hours, he was in surgery, having dead tissue debrided and skin grafts applied. Within a week, he was conscious enough to give a full report. 65 centimeters, weathered skin, hands calloused from nets, spoke broken English, showed photograph of dead son. He described the cave's location, the kelp treatment, the deliberate signaling with the mirror. The intelligence officers took notes, promised to investigate, quietly filed the report under low priority, because what were they going to do? Launch a mission to find one Japanese fisherman among hundreds of fishing villages scattered across thousands of islands? Thank him? Evacuate him? Court-martial him for their own military if they discovered his treason? The war had more pressing concerns. Mitchell's report was noted, classified, and forgotten. 1947 Margaret in 1950, and eventual retirement to a house in Oregon where he could see the Pacific Ocean from his porch and remember. Compassion. The molecular structure of wakame and kombu imprinted into scar tissue like a photograph embedded in skin. Lines and whorls and organic patterns that no skin graft could fully hide. A permanent reminder etched in flesh. Technically true, completely incomplete. Mitchell accepted the medals, placed them in a drawer, rarely looked at them. They weren't what mattered. After the war ended, after occupation began, he wrote letters to the occupation authorities, asked about Minato Ura village, asked about fishermen named Tanaka, got vague responses or no responses. The village had survived the war. Beyond that, information was scarce. Privacy laws, bureaucratic obstacles, the simple reality that 1945 Japan was chaos, millions displaced, records destroyed, priorities focused on preventing starvation and rebuilding infrastructure. One fisherman in 1V. Village wasn't a priority. Sea of Americans during the war. Dead ends. Every lead dissolved like morning fog over the ocean. Survived discovery. Survived the military tribunals that executed hundreds for lesser offenses. Would be in his 80s, 90s, possibly dead. Probably dead. Anna still showed through skin grafts and remember. Remember the cave. Remember the gentle hands. Remember the photograph of Hiroshi. Remember the mirror flashing in sunlight. Remember the smile when Kenji refused to leave. Remember. Ed, 60 years longer than he should have. 60 years borrowed from an ocean that should have claimed him in July 1944. And he decided, one more try. Axe. He placed advertisements in Japanese newspapers, translated by professional services, asking for information about Kenji Tanaka, fisherman, Minato-ura area, possibly 52 years old in 1944. Sand and 4 came from a woman named Aiko Nakamura, 81 years old. She'd been the daughter of Lieutenant Nakamura, the officer who'd brought the death notice about Hiroshi Tanaka. She remembered the Tanaka family, remembered Kenji, had information, being distant fishing grounds. Nobody believed him, his boat's condition, the absence of catch, the timing, but nobody questioned too directly. Lieutenant Nakamura, her father, suspected something but filed no reports. The village protected its own. Weeks later, rumors circulated about an American pilot rescued from a cave, something about kelp treatment. Nakamura investigated quietly, found the cave, found evidence, tarps, containers, traces of kelp paste, confronted Kenji. Confrontation. Aiko couldn't say with certainty. Her father never discussed it directly. But afterward, Nakamura destroyed his notes, filed a report stating the investigation was inconclusive. Kenji continued fishing for the rest of the war, survived the occupation, died in 1973, aged 81, of heart failure while repairing nets on the beach, the same beach where he'd received notification of Hiroshi's death 29 years earlier. He was buried next to his wife, who'd pass ice, said in 1968 in a cemetery overlooking the ocean. His gravestone bore a simple inscription, his name, his dates, and one phrase, Father of Hiroshi, Fisher of Men. Defines a long life, but he cried hearing about Kenji's death, 31 years delayed, from a stranger who'd never met the man but remembered the stories. Aching, just standing. Jennifer asked if he wanted privacy. He shook his head. She stayed. Reasons. Maybe it's enough that you did it, that you chose humanity over duty, that you proved propaganda wrong, that you showed the world, if the world had been paying attention, that we're not demons and savages, just humans, just flawed, complicated, contradictory humans trying to navigate machinery designed to make us monsters. You navigated it. You chose differently, and I got to live because of that choice. So thank you. Arigato. I hope you're with Hiroshi. I hope you know your chiage. Voice mattered, I hope. His voice broke. He couldn't continue. Afraid all the time. Afraid of Americans. Afraid of starvation. Afraid of what we'd become. Kenji wasn't afraid. He seemed peaceful, like he'd made some decision and found contentment in it. We didn't understand at the time. Maybe he'd simply decided that fear wasn't useful, that despite everything, life was worth living with compassion. We thought him strange. Now I think he was wise. 8th birthday. He'd been born July 23, 1921, making the day of his crash also his 23rd birthday. He gathered his entire extended family, 23 people, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren, 11 spouses and partners. He'd never told them the full story. Parts, yes. That he'd been shot down, that someone helped him, but never the details. Never the kelp, never the cave, never the photograph, never the mirror, never the choice that defy, and everything. Another man, 65 years of life. 4. Still visible as faint lines and whirls across his chest and arms. Through every person in this room who exists, because I didn't drown in the Pacific, you're looking at evidence that humanity survives war. Not always, not often, but sometimes, and sometimes is enough to build a life on. Timi, war hurt everyone. The Japanese man who found me wasn't bad. He was good. The best person I ever met. And no, he didn't go to jail. He went back to his fishing boat, back to his life. He made his choice and lived with the consequences quietly. That's courage. Real courage. Not the medals they give you for shooting down planes. The courage to choose compassion when everything around you demands cruelty. Be painless. He was buried next to Catherine in a cemetery outside Portland. His children placed 2 photographs in his casket, per his written instructions. One showed Catherine pregnant, standing in front of the White House in Springfield. The other showed a young Japanese man holding a fish, smiling at the camera, alive and full of future in a moment before history consumed him. 2 photographs, 2 lives, 2 families connected by 8 days in a cave and a decision that defied every institutional pressure to dehumanize enemies. Da can be resisted and humanity preserved even in contexts designed to extinguish both. Isenal uses. The plaque reads, Lieutenant Thomas Mitchell and Kenji Tanaka never spoke the same language, but they understood the only vocabulary that matters. Compassion requires no translation. That something had happened that summer involving his grandfather and an American, but never understanding what. After Kenji died, Takeshi's father, Kenji's younger brother, told him parts of the story. Enough to understand that their family had taken an enormous risk. Enough to understand why Kenji's gravestone said Fisher of Men, from July 1944, showing 8 days with no entries. A photograph of Kenji from 1945, looking older than 53 should look. The weight of the choice visible in eyes that had seen too much. And something else. A mirror, tarnished, pitted with corrosion, but still reflective. The mirror Kenji had used to signal the Catalina. He'd kept it for 29 years, until his death. Never used it for fishing again. Kept it as a private memorial to the moment he chose reason over obedience and saved a life rather than taking one. And father, she told Takeshi through a translator, gave my grandfather a gift beyond measure. Not just life, understanding, evidence that propaganda lies, that enemies are a construction, not a reality, that humanity persists. I spent my whole childhood wondering why Grandpa was different from other veterans, why he never talked about the war with pride or anger, why he seemed almost grateful despite losing friends, despite being shot down, despite the burns. I understand now. He wasn't grateful, for the war. He was grateful for the 8 days after, for proof that compassion survives, for your grandfather's choice, his way. Remembered they were human. Don't know the story in detail. It's been 81 years, memories fade, generations turn over. But elderly residents sometimes remember their parents or grandparents mentioning something about the war, about Kenji, about a choice that could have ended in execution, but instead ended with an American pilot signaling from a rescue boat and a fisherman returning to his nets as if nothing had happened. Lish, the war didn't end because one pilot survived. History didn't change. Kenji's son stayed dead. The bombs still fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan still surrendered. America still occupied. What did 8 days in a cave matter against the crushing momentum of total war? Tification. Because propaganda said Japanese were savages and Americans were demons, and one fisherman proved both claims wrong. Because Thomas Mitchell lived 65 extra years, had 3 children and 7 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren who wouldn't exist if Kenji had made a different choice. Because sometimes one life is enough. Sometimes 8 days is enough. Sometimes a mirror flashing in sunlight is enough. Not to change history, but to prove that history doesn't have to determine every choice, that humans can choose differently, that war doesn't have to win every battle for the soul. 1844. Evidence that couldn't be argued away or dismissed as myth or reduced to propaganda. His body carried proof that an enemy had chosen mercy, that 8 days in a cave had mattered more than years of conflict, that one fisherman's decision had rippled forward through time, creating families and memories and moments that wouldn't otherwise exist. The treaties and surrenders, but the small moments, the 8 days, the kelp applied with gentle hands, the photographs exchanged, the mirror signaling rescue, the choice to see a human rather than a uniform, the decision that compassion matters even, especially, when everything demands cruelty. He a choice, lived with it quietly, and returned to his fishing. That was enough for him. Misses to require cruelty when every voice screams that compassion is weakness. Even then, one person can choose differently. Somebody's husband. Somebody who might, given 8 days in a cave and a handful of kelp, choose to save a life rather than take one. Years after, he should have died. Every single one of those years, every bridge he designed, every fish he caught, every sunset he watched from his porch in Oregon, every moment with Catherine, every memory of holding his children and grandchildren, existed because a 52-year-old fisherman saw a drowning enemy and thought, "This is somebody's son." And that thought, That moment of recognition, that choice to apply kelp rather than alert authorities, mattered more than propaganda, more than pie. Triotism, more than duty to an emperor who would have demanded execution. Generation after generation, conflict after conflict, that we are not what propaganda claims, not demons, not savages, not enemies destined to destroy each other, just humans, complicated, contradictory, capable of both horror and grace. And when we choose grace, when we apply kelp to enemy burns, when we signal rescue for those we're supposed to kill, when we see the sun rather than the uniform, we prove that the machinery of war, powerful as it is, cannot completely extinguish the capacity for CCT, compassion that makes us human.